Welcome to this study of Daniel chapter 1. This study is presented by the Charlotte Church of Christ at 5327 South Tryon Street in Charlotte, North Carolina. My name is Bob Pulliam, and I welcome you to study along with us as we take this book chapter by chapter and try to glean from it lessons that we can apply to our lives. If you've missed the introduction to this study, I would invite you to go ahead and back up and take that in. It's only about 19 minutes long. We hope that you'll watch that first and then come to this video. In Daniel chapter 1, I'm naming this chapter, God Does Not Forget. In fact, each of the chapters we're going to be studying in this series, I'm going to be giving an epithet, a title that really describes it. God Does Not Forget is really about the fact that God had a plan, and the Israelites, they very easily could have concluded that God had forgotten. He had forgotten them, and maybe He's forgotten His plan. Now the big plan is a kingdom. The big plan is the Messiah's kingdom, and it was that's a part of that promise that was made to Abraham in Genesis 12 and verse 3. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's the way in which God is going to bless us. It's in His Messiah's kingdom. But had God forgotten this? As we come to the book of Daniel, we have a people that, as I say, they could have easily drawn that conclusion, God has forgotten. But in fact, He had not. And the book of Daniel will very clearly put on display God's plan, lay out before these people a timeline that they can't see, but that God has squarely in His sights. As we begin here in Daniel chapter 1, we're going to find in chapter 1 that he very quickly does several things. First of all, we introduce the time of these events. We have the time of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and on the throne in Judah, the southern kingdom, is Jehoiakim. We're told that this is the timing for all of this beginning. Now, also introduced for us are four characters. We have one individual in particular, and of course is the namesake for the book, and that's Daniel. But then we have three others. We usually know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Their Hebrew names were actually Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The Babylonians changed their names, and interestingly enough, for the most part in this book, when they are named by their Babylonian names. Now, this book is going to show that God has not abandoned His people, and that's what we're going to learn here in chapter 1. When we look at the Israelite, we see a person who needs to trust God. God has not abandoned His people, His nation. He's not abandoned His plans, and thus He has not abandoned the promises that He had made to these people. Now, as we begin chapter 1, let me just point out one thing that this chapter is not about. And there are not a lot of people who kind of make this out of it, but there are some who do. And that is the idea that, well, God's going to make our food nutritious for us. The Hebrews, they determined that they're just going to only eat vegetables. That's all they're going to eat. And God made it nutritious for them. Well, that is not the point of Daniel chapter 1, as we shall see. Something else that I'd like to point out before we begin is the fact that there are no miracles in Daniel chapter 1. And even though there are no miracles, God is answering prayer. So we begin the book here, and at the very beginning, we read in verse 2 that the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his, Nebuchadnezzar's, hand, along with the vessels of the house of God, so on and so forth. Well, how did God do that? Now, if it was a miracle, then there must be supernatural forces at work. So did Jehoiakim just disappear out of his palace and then suddenly reappear in the tent of Nebuchadnezzar? Well, I don't know anybody that would be silly enough to imagine that that's what this means. What this means is Nebuchadnezzar came up, he besieged the city, as we're told in verse 1, and after a prolonged siege, the city fell, Jehoiakim falls into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. It's a natural process. Did the Lord do it? Yes, he did. Did he do it by a miracle? No, he didn't. But the Lord did do it. And that's important for us. We need to understand that the Lord answers prayer. But he doesn't have to have a miracle in order to answer prayer. When we go on in the text here, we find in verses 3 and 4 that certain individuals are taken into captivity and they end up in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. Did God do that? I believe he did. With all my heart, I believe Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are in Nebuchadnezzar's court because that's where the Lord wanted them. Was it a miracle? It's not a miracle. It was natural forces at work, but God was orchestrating everything. Just because God makes it happen doesn't mean he made it happen by a miracle. And that's important for us. You know, as we go through various crises in our lives, and for example, we have this crisis before us, this pandemic known as the coronavirus or COVID-19. When we go through these, it's important that we understand God does answer prayer. Now, does that necessarily mean that when I pray to him, he's going to keep me from getting it? No, he hasn't promised that. Does that mean that if I do get it, and I pray to him I won't die? Doesn't necessarily mean that either. There are things that need to happen the way they happen, and we don't always understand those things. But God does hear our prayers, and those who are faithful, they do have the best that God is going to give to them and to those who surround them. Now, Daniel is very, very important for us to see the future from the standpoint of these people right here in the time of Nebuchadnezzar and Jehoiakim. It's important because these people need to realize that God sees through the shifting sands of time. He sees everything that will be before it is. He knows the end from the beginning. And what we need to understand then is that we can trust God. And these Hebrews can trust God as well. Now, as we go on in chapter 1, I find Daniel and his three friends quietly serving God. In this chapter, it's not always about just what we want to try to make of it. We look at this chapter and I've known some that they try to make of it that God wants us to have a healthy diet. Well, the Bible does teach us to be moderate, that there is to be moderation in things that we do. And yet at the same time, this chapter really isn't about us becoming vegetarians. It's not about us not having that piece of cake after dinner. And it's not even about us not eating pork, because pork was forbidden as an unclean meat to the Hebrews. I'm not a Hebrew. Never was a Hebrew, and the law was not given to me. The law was only given to the Hebrews. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 through 5 establishes that very clearly. They're the only ones who received the law of Moses. It was received at Mount Sinai. So this isn't really about having a healthy diet. This really isn't even about what might have been wrong with that food. It's not telling all the Hebrews, oh, you need to make sure you don't eat of the king's morsels, of the bounty that the king brings from his table, because not everybody's getting this. The message is for all of the Hebrews, but there are very, very few of the Hebrews who are going to be eating from the king's table. So it's not really about that either. It's actually about what we have in God. There is a lesson to make about being faithful to God, but the real emphasis here is the fact that God was being faithful to these people. It's about God holding true to his promises, and we see it in these four young men and the position that they attain not only in chapter 1, but going into chapter 2 as well, that God is going to have people where He needs them to be so that His plans go through. You know, the incident that we have in chapter 2 is something that we can compare very readily back to Joseph and the dreams of Pharaoh, and Joseph interpreting those dreams. And I don't think it's altogether an accident that we have the same thing going on here when we come to Daniel chapter 2. And what it does is it makes a connection. You know, the people need to realize that God puts who He wants, where He wants them, so His will is done. And they knew from history, their own history, that that's what God did with Joseph. And then here comes Daniel. And Daniel interprets the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And what does the dream tell them? It tells them about the Messiah's kingdom. God does not forget. And we're beginning to see that in chapter 1. We're being introduced to that by what is going on here. And so we have this wonderful emphasis in the care that God has given to His people, and showing that the promise of God is going to go through. Now, I find it interesting that these Israelites did not go on a rebellious hunger strike on this occasion. You know, a lot of times you'll find people today talking about their faith, and they're going to talk about their faith in tough guy. You know, they're going to stand up for the Lord, and they're just really. That's not what I see Daniel and his 3 friends doing. Look with me at verse 8 here of Daniel chapter 1. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Notice that he didn't go on some kind of hunger strike. Instead, he sought permission from the commander of the officials. And seeking that permission, he was given favor that he might accomplish that. And so they got permission to do this. And maybe we ought to stop and think sometime, just kind of wonder. You know, when we take on that tough guy persona, thinking, well, I'm going to stand firm for the Lord, is it really about standing firm for the Lord so much, or might it instead be our own ego that's on the line, that we're just trying to show people how tough we are? I think there's a danger there that we really ought to keep in mind. Now, there's a hidden detail here that we don't perhaps catch on to very quickly, but I might point out that these 4 young men have been in a siege. We might call it the wrong side of the siege, because they were inside the walls and there was starvation. When you have a siege, the food can't get in and people can't get out, and they end up starving. Many people starve to death. And here are these 4 young men, and they've been carried off to Babylon. We don't know from a Bible statement what condition they were in, but we do know what condition people were in when they underwent these sieges. And they were very malnourished. They were very desperate and hungry. And here are 4 young men, and they come into the king's court, and they have provided to them the most wonderful, bountiful feast that could be imagined. Just can't imagine that contrast from starving to death and going all the way to this king's table fare. Think of the temptation that would have presented to these young men. And yet we're told that they had determined that they would not defile themselves. Now, the point of this is not really to tell us how they would have defiled themselves, or that other people need to not defile themselves, although it's a lesson in faithfulness. What we do find here, though, is the very probable situation of unclean meat being set on that king's table. Babylonians, they don't care whether the meat is clean or unclean. You don't know whether there's ostrich on that table, or pork, or beef, or ham. Well, ham is pork. But when you have all of these things and they're prepared in various ways, you won't know just what you're getting. And so, unless you know exactly what it is, you can't eat it. And so they determined, well, there's one thing we know we can eat, and it's the veggies. And so they're going to go for the veggies. It's also a possibility that some of this was sacrificed to idols. Whatever the case might be, these men determine that they don't want themselves to be defiled by that, and so they're going to eat only vegetables. Well, the problem with that is that the Babylonians, they're trying to fatten these men up. And the commander of the officers, he is given a charge whereby he has to make sure that these young men, all who are taken, but these young men in particular, because they're the ones who want an exception, that they are going to be fattened up. And I'm not just pulling that word out of the air. When we go on down into the text, we find that there is a concern of being fatter. Drop down to verse 15, where we see that at the end of 10 days, the probationary period that the officer ended up allowing, at the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. The king doesn't want a skinny, gaunt fella coming before him looking like he's on death's doorstep. He wants them all to be fat. He wants them to be well cared for. They are to reflect royalty. And so that's exactly what they are going to be putting before God. And so we find that this officer of the people, the commander of the officers, I should say, that he's worried, because if that doesn't happen, then it's his head that is at stakes. These youths were away from home, and yet they saw that they needed to be serving God. And so they're going to be faithful to God. And the lesson in all of this is that God is going to be faithful to them. And thus we should never account that the promises of God are vain or futile, but instead God does indeed keep His promises. The king had many advantages to give these youths, and yet they were not going to have their heads turned by this. We could compare this to young people today going off to college, 1,000, 2,000 miles away from home. Dad and mom aren't going to be seeing what they're doing. No one's keeping an eye on them, it would seem. And so, you know, they may get into drugs, they may get into illicit sensual activities, they may be doing things that are evil, that are promiscuous, and they think that they can get away with it because no one's watching. I want you to notice these four youths, they didn't think that way. They weren't serving their parents, and they weren't serving the elders in a church 1,000 or 2,000 miles away. They were serving God. And serving God, they knew that God is a God who sees, and God is a God who does not forget. And they were faithful to Him. And that's what we need to be. But what we need to understand from chapter 1 here is not just that we need to be faithful to God, but we need to always remember that God is always faithful to His promises. And He has made promises, and we need not worry whether they are going to be fulfilled or not. Now I want you to notice something interesting here in the midst of this. When the commander, when we have this proposition made that, give us 10 days. We'll eat just vegetables, and the other youths, you can let them eat what they will, and then compare us, and then just see how all of this comes out. But I want you to notice that in verse 10, the commander of the officials, he says to Daniel, I am afraid of my Lord the king. In other words, he's afraid of Nebuchadnezzar. Well, this is interesting because Daniel has a king too. And Daniel's king is in heaven. Daniel's king is Jehovah. The commander's king is Nebuchadnezzar. And he's afraid of Nebuchadnezzar. But what the commander does not realize is that Daniel's king is the king over Nebuchadnezzar. And we learn that in chapter 2. That Nebuchadnezzar and his entire court come to realize that Daniel's God is a God of gods and a king of kings. And thus Jehovah is the king of Nebuchadnezzar. But Nebuchadnezzar and the commander, they don't realize that now. They will fear the wrong person. Daniel is fearing the right. Now, as we go on here, I want to talk about the outcome of this faithfulness. I've told you that I believe the real thrust of this chapter is that God is the one who's faithful. He is faithful to his promises. And so I want you to notice, picking up in verse 17 of chapter 1, and as for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence and every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. God gave them. You see, God had not forgotten. God had not forsaken his people. He now has 4 young men that he has placed in a very strategic place. And he has done that because he has a plan and he will follow through with it. As we go on in verse 18, at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king talked with them, and out of them all not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. No one was found, no one was found like them. No one. Verse 20, and as for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. Has God remembered? God remembers. And God has a plan. And as we go on in the book of Daniel, we're going to see what that plan is. And we can realize, we can take note of the fact that God does not forget his plan. He does not forget his promises. You know, I'm reminded of 1 Kings chapter 13, where Jeroboam has become king in the north, but Jeroboam has set up idols, one in Dan and one in Bethel. He's induced the northern kingdom to involve themselves in idolatry, and so God sends a prophet to prophesy against Jeroboam. That prophecy took over 250 years to fulfill. God didn't forget, however. It was a long time in coming, but it was roughly 250 years before God fulfilled that promise. What we need to understand is that our God makes promises to us. We need to have faith. We need to never forget that our God does not forget. And in his providence, he will care for us. And above all of that, he has a wonderful home prepared for us. A home where there is no COVID-19, there's no 1918 Spanish flu, there's no tuberculosis, there's no polio, there's none of the heartaches, the sorrows, the death that this earth holds. He has a home for us. Let's keep that in mind as we go forward in the book of Daniel. Thank you very much.